Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to introduce a new kind of negative argument that you can read to kind of swing the balance back your way when affirmatives are very tricky or you feel like affirmative cases are on the side of truth. This year it's a hard topic to be negative on, right? That there are some fairly legitimate problems with our criminal justice system that when the affirmative stands up and reads their plan and makes their argument, we might 1,000,000% agree with them and go, you're right. But if we stood up and said that, we would lose the debate round. So we can, come up with some arguments in terms of some things that we may not agree with, but we can read it to try and win. But even that becomes hard, right? In a world where people are reading, abolish the death penalty because it's applied in a racially biased manner, it's kind of hard to stand up and go, death penalty good. That sure, there are some people who will vote on that, but in a world where the negative or the affirmative team is citing that the death penalty is flawed because of its racial application, maybe we need to come up with something else to do. So the goal of a counterplan is to introduce a different way to do the affirmative. So we're going to talk briefly about 4 or 5 things with a counterplan, and then I'm going to have you work with putting one together for your assignment for today. So the first question we ask is why do we use the counterplan? And sometimes the status quo is hard to defend, right? The AF maybe has picked something that we think is true, right? The death penalty is problematic, or states should, or federal marijuana, laws should decriminalize use or possession, or policing should be reformed. So it may be hard for us to deal with some of these big picture claims that the affirmative is reading. So it's either hard to defend the status quo because the AF might just be right, or the AF advantages sound so good that it might be hard for us to beat them. So in essence, right, the goal of us to become swiper, right, from Dora the Explorer. Our goal is to just read an argument that allows us to stand up and swipe the affirmative case as it's something that we agree with, but the affirmative should lose for a different reason. The second reason to read a counterplan is that it shifts ground back to something familiar for the negative, right? Being affirmative is easy, and everybody who's been out to debate this year, regardless of whether or not they're a novice, will show you that as a squad, we win more affirmative rounds than negative rounds. That's almost universally true for everybody, that it's easier to win on the AF than the neg because you're more prepared to be affirmative. You focus more on the affirmative at the beginning of the year. There are, right, it just is easier for you to control the debate from start to finish as an affirmative team than a negative team where you're kind of left to the mercy of what they want to do. So the goal is to shift the ground back to something familiar for the negative. So the AF could be, the death penalty, mandatory minimums, juvenile sentencing reform, defunding the police, decriminalizing marijuana, any of those things. And if you have a good generic counterplan that you can read, the debate becomes more about how the AF is done instead of the question of whether or not should the affirmative be done. So the example that we'll use in here is the state's counterplan that says instead of the United States federal government doing the plan, the 50 states and relevant territories should do the plan. That allows us to move the debate back in the direction of something that we can understand, right? Most affirmative teams will be able to stand up and pontificate and give sermons on why the reform that they give is the greatest thing in the world, that the death penalty is evil, that marijuana laws are unjust, etc., etc. You now get to hijack that ground, right? You swipe it, it becomes yours, and it now becomes a question of what is the best way to do the plan to solve for its harms or advantages. So, in terms of talking about the parts of a counterplan, there are four pieces or four elements that you need to be familiar with what they are. And what we'll kind of do is walk along through some of these arguments piece by piece. So I'm going to go in my drive and I'm going to open the novice stuff folder that's been shared with y'all since forever ago. So we're going to go novice stuff, the negative packet, and to find our counterplan, we're going to look in the files we haven't talked about yet folder because we haven't talked about counterplans yet. Oh, nope. It's in the disad because it's lumped in with federalism, right? Yep. So as that loads, we're also going to open up a blank Google Doc. In order to be able to kind of build this thing accurately. So here we go. We see the negative position. So we're going to click on the state's counterplan and we're just going to copy and paste the whole generic 1NC as my computer slowly does that. And you can see my Discord notifications popping in because it's one of my comic book friends in Florida. It's her birthday. And she just woke up to see all of her happy birthday messages. Okay. So we've highlighted everything listed in the 1NC. So I'm going to open up or go to my blank Google Doc. And I've got it here. So the first part of the counterplan is the text. Just like there's a plan text, the counterplan needs to have a specific text as well. And you'll notice that just about every single counterplan text that you see in a file will say, here's the front end, insert action of the plan. So we are going to read our counterplan against the death penalty. So we know the action in the death penalty plan text is to abolish the death penalty. So we're going to come up here and we're going to say the 50 states and relevant territories in the United States should abolish the death penalty. Period. Boom. We have our text. So it's now functionally different from the affirmative plan text, which says the United States federal government should do the plan, because the United States federal government is the three branches, right? Congress passes a law, the president signs that law, and if it were to be challenged in court, the Supreme Court would rule in favor of that law. The counterplan now has the 50 states and relevant territories, and that would be things like Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, like Guam, the United States Virgin Islands, like anything that is like a protectorate or has to adhere to certain legal declarations of the United States, even though they're not a full state. That's what the and relevant territories means. So we have our counterplan text. We'll talk about the status in a second because that's not normally something that's in the counterplan, but it's something that you need to be able to defend. So the next item is solvency. Every counterplan will have some kind of generic piece of evidence that says this counterplan can solve the topic. So this piece of evidence, right, says the states can solve everything in the criminal justice system better than the federal government because you're more likely to have contact with the state portion of the justice system than the federal portion, right? Down here in the bottom of this card, it says, over 90% of those who go through the criminal justice system will have no interaction with federal authorities at all. So the argument is the states should do it instead of the federal government because the states have a bigger impact in the realm of criminal justice. So that's our text and that's our solvency. And if we look here in the file, right, there are other elements that you could read, right? So the states solve criminal justice reform in general. Here's a piece of evidence that says they solve policing. Here's something that says they solve sentencing reforms better. Here's something that says that they're better to create experimentation in terms of the law, those kinds of things, right? So you need to be able to argue why the counterplan not just solves the affirmative, but maybe why it might be a little bit more effective. The third element of the counterplan is the net benefit. So that is why should we do the affirmative or the counterplan instead of the affirmative? So just like the affirmative case has advantages that doing the plan solves and the status quo can't solve, the negative team needs to have a net benefit. What is something that the counterplan either solves through the action that the affirmative can't solve, or what is a disadvantage that links to the process of the affirmative but not to the counterplan? So, for the most part, the net benefit to the state's counterplan will be one of two arguments. The first is the federalism disadvantage, and if you scroll down here in the file, there is the federalism disad that says if the federal government does something, the system of balancing powers between the state government and the federal government will come all out of whack, which hurts the ability of state governments to respond to things. So here you have a very simple two card net benefit that says uh, if the federal government did something in criminal justice now, it would limit state policing powers, and those policing powers are key to coronavirus like quarantines, to being able to enforce, curfews, mask regulations, and those kinds of things. And if we don't allow the states to have strong police power, then the Rona will still run rampant and kill millions of people. So we could read those two pieces of evidence at the bottom of the counterplan and have the counterplan and the net benefit together on one piece of paper or in one argument, or we can read the counterplan and then the federalism disadvantage. That tends to be how I like it, because you will have a debate about the counterplan on one piece of paper and you will have a debate about the disadvantage on another piece of paper. The second argument that tends to be a fairly typical net benefit to the federalism disad is the politics disadvantage, which is the one that we have now. The argument is that if we were to pass the plan now, if the federal government were to do some kind of criminal justice reform, it would spark a fight between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, and their fighting would make it impossible to pass another COVID stimulus bill. So the money that, your family might have been eligible for a stimulus check from the federal government that came out in like May or June, uh, based on your level of income, it was the funds that went to all kinds of businesses to help keep them afloat as they were kind of shut down to reduce the spread, right? So it's COVID stimulus good, and the argument is that the plan causes fighting in Congress because they pass a law, but the counterplan does not cause any fighting in Congress because the counterplan doesn't go through Congress. So you tend to have some kind of net benefit. What reason is the counter plan demonstrably better than the plan? You just can't stand up and go, it solves better. There has to be a tiebreaker between the affirmative and the disad, or between the affirmative and the counter plan. And 99% of the time, that tiebreaker is a disadvantage that the affirmative case causes and the counterplan avoids. So we have the text, right? The 50 states and relevant territories should insert action of the plan. We've got our solvency, right? Our piece of evidence that says that that action would solve. And then we have our net benefit, which is either an advantage to the counterplan, so something that the counterplan does that the AF does not, or a disadvantage to the plan that the counterplan does not cause. In terms of the rules or burdens we focus on with counterplans, there are a couple of things that we look at, and the first is competition, right? Why is the counterplan a competitive argument, a competitive idea with the affirmative plan? For it to be competitive, there are two things that we look at, and this is an either or style of competition. The first is mutually exclusive. Mutual exclusivity means these two things literally can't happen at the same time. So if the plan text was to abolish the death penalty and life without parole, and the counterplan only abolished the death penalty but left life without parole intact, those would be mutually exclusive, because you can't get rid of life without parole and keep life without parole at the same time. For the most part, we look at counterplans that compete because they are net beneficial, right? Which is something that we just talked about above with the federalism disadvantage or the politics disadvantage, right? There's either an advantage that the counterplan solves for that the affirmative case does not, or there's a disadvantage that the advantage or the affirmative case causes to happen, but the counterplan avoids the link, right? So that also is a way to compete. And counterplans being net beneficial typically is the way most counterplans compete. Then we have floating over here off to the side, does it have to be topical or does it have to be not topical? This is something that is going to change based on the judge and sometimes even the beliefs of the debater's coach that you're up against. The argument here is that, right, the affirmative team is defending the resolution, right? That they are defending that the federal government should reduce criminal justice reform or enact criminal justice reform. If your counterplan is topical, meaning you also say the federal government should do something with criminal justice reform, then at the end of the day, your counterplan says the resolution is a good idea, which means you vote affirmative. Whereas there are other people in debate who believe that the job of the affirmative is to stand up and prove that their plan is a good idea, not the whole resolution, just the plan. So if at the end of the day, the negative team does something, even if it's topical, if it's an action that's better than the affirmative plan, then you vote negative because the AF didn't win that their plan was a good idea. In terms of your kind of audience breakdown, it tends to be older folks who have been judging debate since like the 90s or competed in debate in the 90s tend to be on the team that says counterplans can't be topical, whereas any folks that you have that are, you know, younger judges, younger coaches believe that the counter or the goal of the negative is just to win, that the AF is not a good idea, and it can be just about anything. So if you get into a debate about whether or not the counterplan is topical or not, or it should or should not be topical, we've got some arguments to kind of help you walk through those, and we'll talk about that in either the second or the third part of the video, or of the Counterplan video series. So the last thing that we'll talk about with counterplans is the status of the counterplan. That's the fourth item that was listed on the pieces, and it's something that you talk about for the most part in cross-examination. So when you read a counterplan, you are essentially telling the judge that there are three kinds of things that they can vote on. Either the affirmative case and the fact that the affirmative case is a good idea, the counterplan, which says the affirmative case done a different way is a good idea, or you're still stuck with the potential world that the status quo is there and that you shouldn't do anything because of like a disadvantage or solvency turns. So in a world where a counterplan is read, right, the affirmative team is stuck defending their affirmative. That advocacy doesn't change throughout the entirety of the round. But the negative team gets a choice between defending the counterplan and agreeing that the status quo is a bad idea, or going, you know what, this counterplan is bad. We think we should do nothing, that we should keep the status quo the same. That the neg now has the ability to kind of change what they want to do strategically throughout the debate. And some people think that that's not fair. So there are some theory arguments that people will read to say the negative team has to do this with the counterplan. So the status of the counterplan is essentially an explanation of under what conditions is the negative team either forced to go for the counterplan in their last speech, or in what circumstances are they allowed to not go for the counterplan in their last speech. If you are negative and you say that your counterplan is unconditional, this means that you can't drop the counterplan. That just like the affirmative team in their first and last speech will say you should vote affirmative because our case is a good idea, an unconditional counterplan is that you should vote for the counterplan in both our first and last speech because we think the counterplan is a better idea than the AF. This is the most limiting strategically for the negative because you are saying no matter what, we are going for the counterplan at the end of the debate. In novice divisions, I don't think that's a bad thing, right? That I think the more that you can kind of dig your heels in and say, this is the argument we're going to not only go for, but also win, you don't have to worry about other kinds of theory debates, right? That's what the last bullet is about. You don't have to worry about, is your counterplan fair, because you can either go for the status quo or anything that's not the counterplan in your final speech. So that's the first kind of status. Unconditional means you're going for the counterplan at the end of the debate. The second type of status, and the one that is the most freeing for the negative, is a conditional counterplan that says, you know what, at any point in the debate, regardless of what the affirmative team says about our counterplan, we can kick out of it, right? We could read the counterplan in the 1NC, and they could read 7 minutes of answers to it, and we could go, you know what, you're right, the state shouldn't do it. So we're going to just talk about our disads and our case defense. This gives the negative team the most flexibility, but I think that that's something that you're worried about when you have more arguments that you're knowledgeable about, or more things that you can do or go for in a debate. While this is the most strategically beneficial for the negative team, where it can become strategically a problem for them is now the negative team can read a bunch of arguments as to why conditional arguments are problematic. Why is it unfair for you to be able to just wipe away 4, 5, 6 minutes of their speech by going, haha, just kidding, we're not going for this argument? So you have to be able to kind of defend why your counterplan is fair under this lens, and that can eat up a lot of time. The last one is dispositional counter, or is a status that is dispositional, which means that the negative team can say, you know what, here are the ways that you can force us to defend the counterplan, and here are ways where we can kick out of the counterplan. So a dispositional counterplan is kind of a compromise with what the neg can do and what the af can do, right? Because there are elements where the affirmative team can be conditional. They can kick out of pieces of their affirmative plan, right? So if you were debating a marijuana af that read a racism advantage and an economy advantage from like a pot industry, and you read a bunch of stuff that says like the economy is resilient and it's not going to collapse and pot is not key to the economy, blah 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 blah, instead of answering all of those arguments, the affirmative team could go, you know what, you're right, we'll concede your defense on the marijuana industry advantage. We're not going to go for our argument about the economy, and then go for everything else. So what this tends to mean is that, if the affirmative team wins some solvency deficits, or they win the permutation, which might prove that the counterplane is not competitive, then the negative team can kick out of it, right? So it's we'll go for our counterplane in the same way that you go for your AF. So if you stand up and have to answer a bunch of reasons why the states are bad, then you can't kick out of the counterplan, right? They have stuck you with the counterplan by reading a bunch of offensive arguments. The very last thing that we'll talk about are some types of counterplans very quickly, but I want you to mostly focus on the state's counterplan for your assignment today. We'll talk about advantage counterplans in depth later, but these are things that do not do the plan text, but they do something different to solve the advantage. Picks are plan inclusive counterplans. These are things that do all or part of the AF. So technically, our counterplan is an agent pick because we do the entirety of the plan, but we do the states instead of the federal government. So a different kind of pick would be, to have the president abolish the death penalty via executive order, or the Supreme Court to do the plan instead of all three branches of government. Agent counterplans change who does the plan. Exclusion counterplans do only part of the affirmative plan. So, like, there are cases that ban both the death penalty and life without parole sentencing, and we've read a counterplan to just ban the death penalty, and then we'll say that, life without parole is not that bad. Or here are instances where it might be good for, like, victims' families and that kind of stuff. So exclusion eliminates part of the AF. Process counterplans could be things like consulting the police unions, consulting, prison guard, all of those different things. These counterplans have not been very good on this topic. And then, hands down, my favorite counterplan is the delay counterplan, which is, you know what, we'll do the AF on a different day. So in election years, when we're debating on the Friday, Saturday, Sunday before, we love to go and say, we should do the plan on the Wednesday after the election, and then go for our politics to say. So this is what I have for you. Also attached to this assignment on Classroom will be a Google Doc with a couple of questions that I want you to answer based on the stuff that I talked about in the video. And then you are going to go through the process of putting together a 1NC counterplan, going through the same steps of what I did in this document here. if you've got any questions, feel free to send me an email, let me know on Google Classroom, any of those things. And yeah, good luck. And thanks for paying attention.